Little Albert experiment. In a small room inside Johns Hopkins University, a baby was placed on a mattress. His name was Albert. He was 9 months old, healthy, calm, smiling. He had no idea what was about to happen, and no way to defend himself from it. The experiment was led by John B. Watson, a psychologist obsessed with behaviorism, the idea that humans could be shaped entirely by their environment. He believed emotions weren't born, they were built, and he intended to prove it. Albert would be his test subject, not by choice, just by chance. At first, they introduced Albert to a series of objects: a white rat, a rabbit, a monkey, a mask. He showed no fear. He reached out with curiosity. He even tried to play. But Watson didn't want peace. He wanted transformation, so he chose the rat. Every time Albert touched the rat, the experimenters struck a steel bar behind him with a hammer. The sound was sudden, jarring, loud enough to make the baby cry instantly. Not once, not twice. Repeatedly, until the association was complete. After several sessions, they brought the rat back, but without the noise. Albert saw it, and he cried. He backed away. He showed clear fear. The rat hadn't changed, but his brain had. This is what Watson wanted: a conditioned fear response, a manufactured phobia. The damage didn't stop there. Soon Albert began reacting the same way to anything that looked like the rat. Rabbits, dogs, a fur coat, even a Santa Claus mask with a white beard. The fear had generalized. His emotional response was no longer specific. It had spread. His mind was now wired to fear anything soft, white, and fuzzy. Watson had made his point. Emotions, he claimed, could be engineered. But he had no interest in fixing what he broke. The experiment ended without any attempt to reverse the conditioning. Albert was taken away. The fear remained. No treatment, no debrief, just a paper, a lecture, and applause from colleagues. What makes this experiment so disturbing isn't just the manipulation of a baby's emotions. It's the utter disregard for his humanity. Albert wasn't seen as a child. He was data, a vessel for a theory. And in that cold laboratory, fear was not discovered. It was built, deliberately, mechanically. The little Albert experiment wasn't just unethical. It was a blueprint for how emotion can be weaponized, how innocence can be shattered, not by accident, but by design. This was the moment psychology crossed a line, and it never really went back. Learned helplessness. It started with a simple box. In a psychology lab at the University of Pennsylvania during the 1960s, a team of researchers led by Martin Seligman designed an apparatus called a shuttle box. It was divided into 2 compartments, separated by a low barrier. On the floor of each compartment was a metal grid capable of delivering electric shocks. At first glance, it looked like a standard behavioral test, a way to observe how animals respond to discomfort. But what unfolded inside that box would reveal something far deeper, something that would eventually reshape how we understand depression, trauma, and the terrifying power of hopelessness. The test subjects were dogs. In the initial phase, the animals were placed into a harness and subjected to unavoidable, unpredictable electric shocks. There was no way to escape, no button to press, no warning. The shocks came randomly, and nothing the dogs did made them stop. They would whimper, struggle, howl, but it didn't matter. After a while, they stopped struggling. They lay down. They endured the pain. And that's when the real experiment began. In the next phase, those same dogs were placed into the shuttle box, the new environment where escape was now possible. If they simply moved to the other side of the box, the shocks would end. The barrier was low. The solution was right in front of them. But they didn't move. They didn't even try. They stayed in place, trembling, absorbing shock after shock, as if they'd already decided that nothing they did mattered. Even though freedom was just one step away, they remained frozen in place. They had learned helplessness. That term, coined by Seligman himself, would become a defining concept in psychology. The idea that if someone is repeatedly exposed to pain or failure that they can't control, They eventually stop trying to escape, not because they're weak, but because they've been trained by experience to believe that resistance is pointless. The implications were massive. What happened to those dogs wasn't just a quirk of animal behavior, it became a mirror for what happens to people. Abused children, war prisoners, trauma survivors, anyone trapped in systems where suffering becomes normalized. In later experiments, Seligman and his team found that dogs who had not experienced the inescapable shocks were quick to learn how to escape the box. They leapt the barrier easily. They were alert, cautious, and responsive. But those who had previously been broken never recovered unless they were physically shown again and again that escape was possible. Even then, some never tried. The study became a turning point in the understanding of depression. Before this, depression was often seen as laziness, weakness, or chemical imbalance. But learned helplessness suggested that psychological experience, especially prolonged failure, punishment, or abuse, could literally train the brain to surrender. People trapped in poverty, children in broken households, victims of manipulation, survivors of disasters. If the world repeatedly shows you that nothing you do will change your outcome, you stop trying. And when you stop trying, you stop hoping. The experiment didn't end with dogs. Later studies repeated the process with rats, monkeys, and even humans, through rigged games, unsolvable puzzles, and tasks designed to ensure failure. Again and again, people who experienced prolonged, uncontrollable frustration stopped engaging, even when the solution became obvious. They didn't need to be convinced they were powerless. They already believed it. And that belief, Seligman found, was harder to undo than the shock itself. Over time, learned helplessness found its way into studies of abusive relationships, workplace burnout, long-term incarceration, and addiction. It explained why people sometimes stay in dangerous environments, not because they want to, but because they've been conditioned to feel like there's no exit. But the tragedy of learned helplessness isn't just that it causes suffering, it's that it buries the one tool that suffering people need most: agency. The ability to act, to resist, to escape, to fight back. When that's gone, the person who remains might look calm from the outside, quiet, compliant, still, but inside, they are no longer choosing, they're enduring, just like the dogs in the box, just like the children in the silence, just like the mind that learned, somewhere along the way, that trying is the most painful act of all. Deep brain stimulation, DBS experiments. At first glance, it seemed like a miracle. Electrodes, carefully placed deep inside the brain, connected to a device no larger than a matchbox, sending electrical pulses to silence tremors, calm seizures, and restore motor control. It was called deep brain stimulation, or DBS, a medical breakthrough. But as the procedure became more common in the treatment of Parkinson's disease, epilepsy, and chronic pain, researchers began exploring a different, far more volatile question. What else could we control? Could we alter emotion, mood, even personality, not through therapy or drugs, but with the flick of a switch? DBS works by implanting electrodes into precise regions of the brain, most commonly the subthalamic nucleus, or globus pallidus, for movement disorders. A wire runs under the skin to a pulse generator, often placed near the collarbone. This device delivers constant or programmable stimulation, interrupting abnormal neural signals. Patients with Parkinson's, for example, often experience immediate relief from tremors the moment the device is activated. It's breathtaking, like rebooting a corrupted system. But in early trials and follow-ups, unintended effects began to surface. Some patients reported sudden emotional shifts. One man became giddy and euphoric, laughing uncontrollably during activation. Another fell into a depressive slump minutes after stimulation began. A few developed impulse control disorders, excessive gambling, hypersexuality, or risk-seeking behaviors they had never exhibited before. The implications were enormous. By targeting different regions, such as the nucleus accumbens or ventral capsule, DBS was shown to reduce symptoms of severe depression and obsessive-compulsive disorder, even in patients resistant to all other treatments. But the side effects could be unpredictable: personality blunting, emotional detachment, loss of identity. In one trial, a patient's family claimed the person who returned from surgery was not the same. Their interests had changed, their sense of humor, their relationship dynamics. As one spouse said, "He's not sick anymore, but he's not him either." This raised urgent ethical concerns. If we can suppress pain, lift mood, and dampen trauma with a machine, what happens to free will? Where is the line between healing and editing the self? Experiments with DBS soon expanded to more controversial frontiers. Researchers began testing stimulation for addiction, hoping to suppress cravings by targeting the brain's reward centers. Some trials looked at aggression control, inspired by older psychosurgical models, except now, the process was reversible. You didn't have to destroy brain tissue, you just had to dial in a frequency. But reversible doesn't mean harmless. There were cases where turning off the device triggered emotional crashes, panic, or suicidal thoughts. Other times, the hardware malfunctioned, leaving patients with unpredictable spikes in mood or motor function. One of the most haunting elements of DBS is its potential for remote control. Some systems allow adjustments through wireless devices. In clinical settings, this can be used to fine-tune outcomes. But imagine what it would mean in the wrong hands. A person's anger, fear, or passivity turned up or down at will. This is no longer theoretical. Research is ongoing in areas like neurosecurity, where concerns have been raised about protecting implants from outside tampering. The brain, once a sanctuary of privacy, now has ports. And even if the technology stays secure, who decides what setting is normal? The person, the doctor, the insurance company? Deep brain stimulation holds extraordinary potential for healing, for giving back lives once lost to disease. But it also raises profound philosophical questions about identity, control, and whether your mind still belongs to you when it's wired to a machine. Stanford Prison Experiment. In the summer of 1971, inside the quiet psychology department of Stanford University, a prison was built. Not a real prison, at least not officially, just a mock one, constructed in the basement. Bare walls, barred doors, corridor, traps formed into a hallway of cells. It was supposed to be an experiment, just 2 weeks long, a simulation. What happened inside those walls would become one of the most disturbing demonstrations of human behavior ever recorded. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo designed the study to answer a single question: what happens when ordinary people are placed in positions of power over others? Is cruelty a personality trait? Or does the situation itself breed cruelty? Zimbardo recruited 24 healthy, middle-class college students, volunteers with no criminal background, no mental health issues, no history of violence. They were paid $15 a day to participate in what they were told was a simple study about prison life. Participants were randomly assigned to 2 roles: guards or prisoners. It was meant to be equal, fair, controlled. But the moment the labels were applied, everything changed. The prisoners were unexpectedly arrested at their homes by real police officers. Booked, fingerprinted, blindfolded, they were brought to the basement of Stanford and stripped of their identity. Their clothes were taken. They were dressed in smocks, given a number, and instructed to refer to themselves only by that number. Their names were erased. The guards were given khaki uniforms, mirrored sunglasses, and wooden batons. They were told to maintain order. No specific instructions on how, just that they were in charge. What followed was not a simulation, it was a descent. On the first day, things were awkward. Students played their roles with hesitation, but by the second day, the line between play acting and real cruelty began to dissolve. The guards started issuing arbitrary punishments, push-ups, standing in silence, withholding food. They forced prisoners to clean toilets with their bare hands. They made them chant their numbers for hours. Humiliation became the norm. By day 3, prisoners were breaking down. One began to cry uncontrollably, curled in a corner. Another screamed in rage, demanding to leave. Zimbardo, acting as the prison's superintendent, denied their request. The experiment was supposed to be voluntary, but inside that basement, it stopped feeling that way. The guards grew more aggressive. They acted not like students, but like predators. Some developed twisted routines, forcing prisoners to strip, simulating sexual acts, or denying them sleep. The prisoners began to lose their sense of time, of self. Their identities dissolved into obedience and fear. Rebellion was punished. Silence was rewarded. Even the prisoners who didn't break visibly were altered. They complied. They whispered. They submitted. No one told the guards to be cruel. No one told the prisoners to obey, but they did because they believed it. By day 6, the situation had spiraled so far out of control that a graduate student, Christina Maslach, visited the prison and was horrified. She demanded the experiment be stopped. Zimbardo resisted at first. He had become so immersed in his role as warden that he had lost sight of the ethics, the damage, the reality. But eventually, he relented. The experiment, planned for 2 weeks, was shut down in less than 1. When the data was reviewed, the results were staggering. No participants, neither guard nor prisoner, had any previous record of violent behavior. Yet in the right environment, with the right roles, cruelty bloomed naturally, systematically, almost effortlessly. Zimbardo had proven more than he intended. Not just that power corrupts, but that systems shape people faster than people realize. The experiment revealed something chilling. We are not who we think we are. We are who we are allowed to become. In the wrong environment, you don't need to be a bad person to do bad things. You just need a role, a uniform, and permission. The Stanford prison experiment was hailed as a breakthrough and condemned as a warning. Its ethics were scrutinized, its methods attacked. Some called it flawed, even theatrical. But no one could deny the raw psychological truth it exposed. The lesson was not about prisons. It was about power. It was about obedience. It was about how thin the surface of civility really is and how quickly it tears. This experiment didn't happen in some distant totalitarian state. It happened in an American university, among bright, educated students. And yet, under the right conditions, they built a system of abuse in less than 48 hours. When given authority without accountability, people lose their empathy. When stripped of identity, people lose their resistance. And when no one intervenes, cruelty escalates, quietly, then rapidly. The Stanford prison experiment wasn't a look into a fake prison. It was a mirror, and what we saw staring back wasn't just disturbing, it was us. Infant deprivation studies. In the 1940s, long before the rise of modern developmental psychology, a quiet horror unfolded inside orphanages and hospitals across North America and Europe. The rooms were clean, the babies were fed, the beds were made, and yet behind those sterile walls, something invisible and deadly was happening. Infants were dying, not from disease or injury, but from something far harder to measure. They were dying from the absence of touch. These weren't accidents. These were early infant deprivation studies, conducted under the belief that physical affection was unnecessary, even dangerous. Many doctors at the time believed too much cuddling would spoil a child. The dominant theory was that food, shelter, and cleanliness were the only true requirements for a healthy baby. Emotions were secondary. Attachment was indulgent. Love, they said, was a luxury. So they designed systems that removed it. Infants in state-run institutions were placed in cribs for nearly 24 hours a day. They were fed on strict schedules, often with bottles propped on pillows. No eye contact, no holding, no voice. The APAs were changed without affection. Cries were ignored, as long as basic needs were met. There were no lullabies, no rocking, no warmth beyond what the blankets provided. And then something strange began to happen. Even though the babies were being fed, even though they were technically safe, they began to waste away. They stopped making eye contact. They stopped crying. They stopped moving. Many of them simply gave up. This mysterious decline became known as failure to thrive, and it was lethal. In some institutions, up to 30–40% of infants died within the first 2 years, not from infection, but from psychological neglect, so severe that it crippled their will to live. One of the earliest observers of this tragedy was Dr. Reimer Spitz, a psychoanalyst who studied children in orphanages and found that those raised without maternal affection showed delayed development, emotional withdrawal, and severe cognitive impairment. He documented cases where healthy infants, once removed from their mothers and placed in these sterile environments, began to deteriorate rapidly, losing weight, failing to speak, and in some cases, dying without clear medical cause. Spitz filmed some of these children. In one haunting reel, an infant sits in a crib, motionless, rocking slightly, eyes fixed on nothing. Her hands flutter occasionally, but she does not reach. She does not cry. She does not respond when her name is called. This was the result of a sensory and emotional vacuum. Later, these findings were echoed by John Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, and by Harry Harlow, whose monkey experiments we explored earlier. Harlow's wire mother studies demonstrated what human institutions had already shown. Unintentionally but clearly, deprivation of touch, affection, and bonding is as harmful as starvation. Some researchers began to push back, advocating for more humane caregiving, but others kept treating infants like experiments, blank slates to be controlled. In the infamous 1950s Yale studies, babies were separated from their mothers at birth and placed in strictly managed isolation environments. Researchers monitored how they responded to being fed by machines, to being cleaned by gloved hands, to being spoken to without being touched. The findings were disturbing. Many of the infants failed to develop the capacity for trust or empathy. Some never learned to form attachments. Others grew up with deep emotional impairments, unable to regulate their feelings, hypersensitive to rejection, and chronically anxious. The institutions eventually began to change. Slowly. By the 1970s and 80s, the idea that love was optional had lost its grip. Science finally began catching up to something mothers and fathers had known all along, that a baby isn't just a body, it's a mind, a heart, a nervous system built for connection. But by then, thousands of children had already passed through the rooms with no light, not dead, necessarily, but damaged, unseen, forgotten. And even today, in parts of the world where orphanages are underfunded, where hospitals still operate with understaffed nurseries, the echoes remain. Babies lie in cribs without being held, children cry until their voices fade, and developmental damage begins, not with violence, but with silence. The deprivation studies were never meant to kill, but they revealed a truth darker than most medical experiments ever dared to show. You don't have to hurt a child to break them. You just have to stop loving them. Soviet sleep experiment, urban legend. This story didn't come from a textbook. It came from somewhere darker. The Soviet sleep experiment is widely considered a modern myth, a creepypasta, an internet horror tale. But myths stick around for a reason, because beneath the fiction is something disturbingly familiar. According to the story, the experiment took place in the late 1940s, in the aftermath of World War II, at the height of Cold War paranoia. Soviet scientists were said to be developing a gas-based stimulant, a chemical compound designed to eliminate the human need for sleep. They believed if soldiers could stay awake indefinitely, they'd become unstoppable, machines of focus, vigilance, and obedience. To test this theory, 5 political prisoners, men labeled as enemies of the state, were locked in an airtight military testing chamber. They were promised freedom if they could remain awake for 30 consecutive days. The room was sealed. The stimulant gas was pumped in. There were no windows, only microphones, cameras, and a two-way intercom. The subjects had access to water, dried food, a toilet, and enough bedding for comfort, but no privacy, no clocks, no way to tell time. They were watched constantly. At first, everything seemed fine. The men talked, joked, and shared stories. The gas kept them alert. There was laughter. Suspicion was low. Their behavior was mostly normal for the first 3 days. But then things began to shift. By day 5, their tone changed. The men grew paranoid, convinced they were being lied to. They began to whisper to themselves, not in fear, in obsession. One man started pacing in tight circles. Another stared into a corner for hours, unblinking. By day 6, their conversations turned dark. Delusions, hallucinations, fragmented memories. They began to accuse each other of sabotage, of betrayal. Trust broke down. Then came the silence. One of the subjects described in the story as once charismatic and talkative stood up and began screaming. He howled for 3 hours straight until his voice collapsed into a series of wet gasps. He kept moving his mouth, but no sound came out. Later, they discovered he had torn his own vocal cords. After that, the chamber grew quiet. Too quiet. The remaining subjects stopped talking. They stopped responding to the intercom. The only sounds were the rustle of fabric, the occasional shuffling of bare feet, and the low, ever-present hiss of the gas. Researchers suspected something had gone wrong with the system. Then they looked at the oxygen consumption. It was still normal. The men were alive, just not communicating. On day 15, the researchers made a decision. They turned off the gas, announced they would open the chamber, and that's when the screaming returned. A chorus of voices begging them to turn the gas back on, pleading, screaming, threatening. One of them shouted, "Fee! No longer want to be freed. Fee!" What the researchers saw when they finally opened the door became the centerpiece of the legend. The scene was horrifying. One subject was dead. The others were alive, but barely recognizable. They had torn flesh from their arms and legs, ripped muscle down to the bone. Their abdomens had been opened, organs partially removed, but not in panic or pain. In precise, almost surgical mutilation, yet none of them had attempted to escape. Their eyes were wild. They smiled when the light hit them. One man, missing most of his lips, laughed through broken teeth. They were restrained, sedated, and removed from the chamber for examination. But even under heavy sedation, they fought violently. They screamed when the gas was taken away. One died from a ruptured artery, not from the wounds but from the stress of being cut off from the gas. What followed was surgery to repair their bodies. Anesthesia was offered. They refused. The patients, if they could still be called that, insisted on being kept awake, begging for the stimulant gas. One subject, during surgery, laughed uncontrollably when his chest was opened and his heart was exposed. He whispered, "Keep cutting, I must stay awake." In the story's final moments, only one man remains conscious, restrained, mutilated, but alert. When asked what he was, he replies, "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within all of you. We are what you hide from in your beds at night. We are what you sedate into silence when you sleep." Then, in the final act, he is shot. The experiment ends. Or does it? Again, this story is fictional. There are no declassified records of this experiment. No real gas, no chamber, no names. But it feels real, because the psychology is real. In the world of modern science, we know what happens to the mind and body under extreme sleep deprivation. At 24 hours, attention declines. Emotions become unstable. At 48, hallucinations begin. By 72 hours, paranoia, memory loss, and muscle failure take over. At 96 hours and beyond, reality fragments. Personality dissolves. Some subjects report hearing voices, seeing things that aren't there, feeling like they're no longer themselves. Sleep deprivation doesn't just exhaust you, it destroys you. It breaks cognition, disrupts hormonal regulation, and alters the perception of pain, space, and self. In military black sites and secret prisons, sleep deprivation has been used as psychological torture. Victims describe it as one of the most unbearable experiences of their lives, and in some cases, permanent damage follows. In that context, the Soviet sleep experiment becomes more than a ghost story. It becomes a metaphor for what happens when the natural limits of the human body are not respected, but violated, systematically, methodically, intentionally. The real horror isn't the blood. It's the idea that a human being could be reduced to this, not by monsters, but by researchers, not in a haunted house, but in a lab. Milgram obedience study. In 1961, a man in a white lab coat told another man to push a button. That man hesitated. He looked anxious, uncertain, but the lab coat spoke again, firm, calm, assured. The experiment requires that you continue. So the man pushed the button, and from behind the wall, someone screamed. This wasn't a scene from a dystopian novel. It was real. It was a study. And it became one of the most disturbing and revealing psychological experiments ever conducted. Stanley Milgram, a social psychologist at Yale University, wanted to understand a question that haunted the world in the aftermath of the Holocaust. How could ordinary people, neighbors, teachers, shopkeepers, participate in atrocities just because someone in authority told them to? Milgram's theory was chilling in its simplicity. Maybe it wasn't about cruelty, maybe it was about obedience. To test it, he created a deceptive setup. Participants, ordinary volunteers, were told they were taking part in a study on learning and memory. They were introduced to another man, who they believed was a fellow participant, randomly assigned the role of learner. In reality, the learner was an actor. The real subject was always assigned the role of teacher. The teacher sat in front of a machine, an imposing panel of switches labeled with voltages from 15 all the way up to 450 volts. Each switch had a description: slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, all the way to XXX, danger, severe shock. The experiment seemed simple. Read a series of word pairs to the learner. If he answered correctly, move on. If he got it wrong, deliver a shock, and increase the voltage each time. The learner was strapped to a chair in another room. The teacher could hear him through a speaker, but couldn't see him. At first, the learner made a few mistakes. The teacher pressed the switch. The light flashed. The learner grunted, but as the shocks increased, so did the intensity of the learner's reactions. He began to protest. He shouted that he had a heart condition. He begged to be released. At 270 volts, he screamed in agony. At 300, he pounded on the wall. At 315, he fell silent. No response at all. And still, the man in the lab coat, Milgram's assistant, calmly told the teacher, "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue." And many of them did. In the original study, 65% of participants went all the way to the maximum voltage, 450 volts, believing they had delivered a potentially lethal shock. They weren't sadists. They were teachers, salesmen, engineers, postal workers, everyday people. Many sweated, trembled, bit their lips, groaned. Some laughed nervously, some protested verbally, but most obeyed. Because they were told to, Milgram had found his answer. Under the pressure of authority, people will do things that violate their deepest moral beliefs, not because they want to, but because they feel they have no choice. The responsibility, they believe, is not theirs, it's the authorities'. Milgram called it the agentic state, a psychological condition in which people see themselves as mere instruments carrying out someone else's orders. They are no longer autonomous, no longer acting on conscience. They are obeying, and obedience, Milgram showed, is far more powerful than we like to admit. The implications were staggering. If you put a man in a white coat, in the right environment, people will hurt others, even kill, just to follow instructions. After the experiment, many participants were shaken. Some cried when they learned the learner hadn't really been shocked. Others expressed deep guilt, shame, and confusion. They had seen themselves in a light they couldn't unsee. Critics argued that Milgram's methods were unethical, manipulative, even cruel. He had pushed people to the brink of psychological trauma. But the horror wasn't in what he did. It was in what they did, and what they were willing to do. Milgram's findings have been replicated across countries, cultures, and decades. Variations of the experiment found that the more distant the victim, or the more authoritative the setting, the more likely people were to obey. When someone else pressed the switch, obedience rose even higher. Distance, detachment, and delegation, all of them greased the gears of cruelty. Milgram never said humans were evil, but he showed that under the right conditions, good people can do horrifying things, without shouting, without rage, without hate, just by following orders. And perhaps that's the scariest part. It doesn't take monsters to commit monstrous acts, just silence, just pressure, just a voice in a white coat, saying, "The experiment requires that you continue." The Monster Study. In 1939, at the height of World War II, an experiment was quietly conducted in the American Midwest, one that never made headlines, never made newsreels, and never should have happened. It didn't involve chemicals or electric shocks. There were no prisons, no batons, no physical restraints, only words. But the damage it left was just as deep, and it stayed buried in silence for decades. The experiment was conducted at the University of Iowa under the guidance of Wendell Johnson, a respected speech pathologist. He was a man who had stuttered all his life and had dedicated his career to understanding it. But like many scientists of his time, Johnson wanted proof. He wanted to test a theory, and to do so, he needed children. 22 of them. They were all orphans. Most of them lived in the Iowa Soldiers and Sailors Orphans Home, a state-run institution, already abandoned, already vulnerable, and now unknowingly enrolled in a psychological experiment. The children were split into two groups. The first group consisted of children who already stuttered. They were treated kindly, encouraged. Their speech was accepted, supported, gently corrected with praise. But the second group, children with normal, fluent speech, were told the opposite. They were told that their speech was filled with flaws, that they stuttered, that something was wrong with them. Over and over again, they were interrupted constantly, scolded for hesitation, told to speak slower, more carefully, to watch every word. They were made to feel self-conscious about sounds they never noticed before. The goal? To see if they could induce a stutter where none had existed. And they did. Some of the children in the second group began to withdraw. They spoke less. Some stopped speaking altogether. Others became deeply anxious. One little girl, who had once been talkative and bright, was reduced to silence in public. Her voice, her confidence, was gone. This wasn't accidental. It was intentional. A slow psychological suffocation, carried out under the pretense of science. It came to be known, ironically and chillingly, as the monster study. Not because the children were monsters, because the researchers were. Wendell Johnson never published the findings in a major journal. He knew the ethical line had been crossed, but the data existed, and decades later, when it finally surfaced, the backlash was fierce. By then, it was too late. Many of the children never fully recovered. Some grew into adulthood with permanent speech issues. Others lived with a deep-seated anxiety that they never traced back to that sterile office in Iowa, because they never knew they had been subjects. They had been told it was speech therapy. The most tragic part? This wasn't done to criminals, or soldiers, or consenting adults. It was done to children, vulnerable, voiceless children, living in institutions where no one would question an outsider in a lab coat. The justification was scientific curiosity. The belief that the ends justified the means, that insight into the nature of speech was worth the risk of permanently damaging a few lives. But that's what makes this experiment so terrifying. There were no electrodes, no cages, no drugs, only words. Spoken with enough authority, with enough repetition, even a falsehood can become a prison. Tell a child they're broken, and they start to believe it. Not because they are, but because someone told them they were. Psychology has long taught us that identity is fragile, that language can shape thought, that confidence, once cracked, doesn't easily heal. The monster study proved all of this in the worst way imaginable, and it forced the scientific community to confront a hard truth. Even the search for knowledge can become an act of violence when empathy is removed. Wendell Johnson believed he was helping the world understand stuttering. He may have, but in doing so, he also reminded us of something far more important, that children are not data points, that minds are not playthings, that silence is not always a symptom, it is sometimes the scar, and that sometimes monsters wear ties, carry clipboards, and speak with soft, professional voices. Project MK Ultra. It began with a fear, the fear that the human mind could be hacked. During the Cold War, US intelligence officials were panicked by rumors, whispers that enemy governments, Soviet Russia, Communist China, North Korea, had developed secret techniques to control minds, to extract confessions, erase memories, or even turn men into unknowing assassins. The fear wasn't entirely paranoid. American prisoners of war in Korea had confessed to crimes they hadn't committed. Some had changed their beliefs entirely. The CIA wanted to know, was this brainwashing real? Could it be reproduced? weaponized. And so they launched a secret program, a sprawling, tangled, deeply disturbing effort to unlock, invade, and control the human mind. The name was MK Ultra. From 1953 to the early 1970s, MK Ultra operated under layers of secrecy, funded by the CIA and hidden from public view. It didn't look like a military operation. It looked like science, clinical, clean. But beneath the lab coats and chalkboards, it was something else entirely. MK Ultra wasn't one experiment. It was a network of over 150 sub-projects, conducted in universities, hospitals, prisons, and covert CIA facilities across North America. Many of the subjects didn't even know they were part of a study. They were students, soldiers, mental health patients, civilians in bars. They didn't sign up. They were used. And the most infamous tool they used was LSD. LSD, or lysergic acid diethylamide, was new at the time. It had the ability to completely dismantle a person's perception of reality, hallucinations, time distortion, emotional extremes, ego death. It didn't just confuse, it dissolved. And to the CIA, that meant potential. They began testing LSD in every way imaginable. Some subjects were told they were taking a new drug. Others were dosed without warning. A glass of water, a cigarette, a cocktail, at a party. What followed was often pure psychological collapse, panic, paranoia, violent emotional swings, complete disorientation. Then, the real test began. Subjects were observed through one-way mirrors, sometimes alone, sometimes with agents sitting calmly beside them, asking questions, pushing their thoughts into stranger directions. In other versions, subjects were bombarded with strobe lights, disorienting sounds, or placed in isolation for hours, sometimes days on end. This wasn't observation, it was manipulation. The goal wasn't to see what happens, it was to see how far they could go. In one case, a subject was kept awake for over 70 hours, dosed repeatedly, interrogated under the effects. Another was kept in a sensory deprivation tank, on LSD, until he begged to know whether he was alive or dead. And in the most twisted branch of the program, Operation Midnight Climax, CIA agents used prostitutes on the agency's payroll to lure unsuspecting men to apartments wired with microphones and hidden cameras. Once inside, the men were secretly dosed with LSD. Then, the agents watched from behind mirrored glass. They weren't looking for data in the traditional sense. They were studying control, how to break it, how to take it, how to use sex, fear, and drugs to dissolve someone's will. It was pure exploitation. One man, Frank Olson, wasn't a test subject. He was a scientist working for the US Army in biological weapons research. At a CIA retreat, he was secretly dosed with LSD. He didn't know. Within days, he began to unravel. He questioned the work he had done. He grew paranoid, distrustful. Then, in a hotel room in New York, he fell or was pushed out of a 13th-story window. The official story was suicide, but later evidence, including a second autopsy, suggested foul play. Olson's death became a symbol of MK Ultra's darkness, a man shattered by the very institution he served, and possibly silenced by it. But Olson was just one of many. At Montreal's Allen Memorial Institute, psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron received CIA funding to carry out Sub-Project 68. Here, patients seeking treatment for anxiety or depression were unknowingly subjected to a process called psychic driving. Step 1. Induce regression. Patients were put into drug-induced comas lasting up to 60 days. While unconscious, they were injected with high doses of LSD or other psychoactive drugs. Step 2. Break the identity. When awake, they were subjected to electroconvulsive therapy at levels far beyond the norm. The goal wasn't to stabilize, it was to erase. Step 3. Reprogram. Once minds were wiped clean, or damaged enough, recordings were played through headphones, over and over again, for hours a day. Repetitive messages like, "You are not a bad person," or "You will not be afraid," were looped thousands of times. It sounds absurd, even fictional, but it was real. and it was devastating. Some patients forgot how to speak. Some lost control of basic functions. Others never recovered their memories or sense of self. They came in for help. They left as ghosts of who they were. The full scope of MK Ultra's experiments may never be known. In 1973, as Watergate exploded and public scrutiny turned inward, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all MK Ultra records destroyed. What we know today comes from surviving fragments, documents that were misfiled, leaked, or salvaged in time. The public first learned about MK Ultra through the 1975 Church Committee hearings, where stunned senators listened to testimonies about unconsenting human experiments, covert drugging, and fatal consequences. It was the moment the American public realized that their own government had, in secret, conducted experiments on its own people. The justifications were always the same. We had to know. The Soviets were doing it too. It was for national security. But the truth was simpler. They thought they could get away with it. MK Ultra wasn't just about drugs. It was about power. About what happens when science is given no ethical boundaries, and secrecy becomes more important than humanity. It wasn't just a violation of medical ethics. It was a violation of trust, of reality, of the mind itself. And the most terrifying lesson MK Ultra leaves behind, that the most dangerous weapon is not a gun or a bomb. It's belief. Because once someone believes you're in control of their mind, you don't need to chain their body. You already own them. Tuskegee Syphilis Study. It began in 1932 in the town of Tuskegee, Alabama, and for the next 40 years something horrific unfolded. Not in secret laboratories, not in foreign war zones, but in plain sight, under the authority of the US government. The Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male was run by the US Public Health Service. The stated goal was to observe the progression of untreated syphilis in black men. Officials claimed it was a medical study, a chance to understand the disease. In truth, it was a slow, calculated violation of trust and of life. The study enrolled 600 African American men, most of them poor sharecroppers. 399 of them had syphilis, 2,000 did not. None of the men were told the truth. They were told they were receiving treatment for bad blood, a vague local term used to describe fatigue, pain, or general illness. They were promised free medical care, meals, and burial insurance. But they were not given treatment for syphilis, not even when treatment became widely available. At the start of the study, syphilis was still considered dangerous and difficult to treat. But by the mid-1940s, penicillin had been proven to cure it. It became the standard treatment worldwide, and yet, the researchers withheld it. They deliberately chose not to treat the men. They continued to monitor the progress of the disease, watching as it attacked the brain, the heart, the nervous system. They documented symptoms, pain, paralysis, blindness, organ failure, death. Autopsies were performed to gather data. The bodies became evidence. But none of the victims knew they were part of an experiment. They were not told they had syphilis. They were not told they were being left untreated. They were not given the cure. Some men tried to enlist in World War II, but were blocked from receiving treatment by the very government that had infected them. Wives became infected. Children were born with congenital syphilis. Entire families were devastated, while the researchers continued to collect data. There was no single villain. This wasn't the work of a rogue agent. It was managed by doctors, government employees, academics, medical institutions. The names changed over time, but the plan remained. The study was allowed to continue for decades, across different presidential administrations, different political parties, and through the rise of civil rights movements. In 1966, a young epidemiologist named Peter Buxton learned about the study and filed an official protest. He was ignored. He filed again. Nothing happened. Finally, in 1972, he leaked the information to the press. That's when the public found out. The backlash was immediate. Outrage spread across the country. Only then was the study finally shut down, 40 years after it began. By that time, dozens of the men had died. Many more had suffered irreversible damage. Their families were shattered. Trust in the medical system, especially among African Americans, was deeply broken. A formal investigation followed. In 1973, a class action lawsuit was filed. The government eventually settled, but no criminal charges were brought against the researchers. Not one. It wasn't until 1997, 25 years after the study ended, that President Bill Clinton formally apologized on behalf of the US government. By then, only 8 of the original victims were still alive. The Tuskegee study is one of the clearest examples of systemic abuse in modern medical history. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was a decision, a choice maintained over 4 decades to let men suffer and die for the sake of observation. And what makes it especially disturbing is how ordinary it looked. There were no labs with torture devices, no dramatic experiments, just clinics, paperwork, doctor visits, smiles, promises of care. But behind those smiles was silence, and that silence was deadly. This wasn't about science. It was about power, about who has the right to know the truth, about who gets to be protected and who gets studied like a lab rat in human skin. Even today, the shadow of Tuskegee lingers. In many communities, especially Black communities in America, there's still deep mistrust toward medical institutions. Some of that mistrust traces directly back to this experiment. And it's not paranoia, it's history. Tuskegee didn't fail because the science was wrong. It failed because the ethics were absent. The subjects were treated as objects, as bodies, as data points. And no matter how quietly it was done, no matter how clean the forms looked or how polite the doctors sounded, it was still a slow, clinical act of harm. An experiment that let people die, not because there was no cure, but because the men chosen to suffer were never meant to be saved. David Reimer case. This story begins with an accident. In 1966, in Winnipeg, Canada, a baby boy named Bruce Reimer was born. Healthy, normal. But when he was just a few months old, his parents noticed he had trouble urinating. Doctors diagnosed him with a minor condition, phimosis, a common issue with the foreskin. The recommended solution was simple: circumcision. But what happened next wasn't simple at all. The procedure went wrong. Instead of using a scalpel, the doctors used an electrocautery device, a heated needle designed to burn tissue. Something malfunctioned. Bruce's penis was completely destroyed in the process. The Reimer family was devastated. They didn't know what to do. There was no way to surgically reconstruct what had been lost. No advanced medical options. And in their search for answers, they were introduced to a man who claimed to have one. Dr. John Money. Money was a psychologist and sexologist at Johns Hopkins University. He was a rising figure in gender theory, at the time, known for radical ideas about how gender identity is formed. He believed that gender was not something you were born with, it was something you were taught, a product of nurture, not nature. And now, Bruce Reimer presented him with what he saw as the perfect test case. Dr. Money suggested a bold solution: raise Bruce as a girl, give him a new identity, dress him in girl's clothes, call him by a new name, perform gender reassignment surgery, feed him a new narrative. According to Money's theory, if the environment was right, the child would grow into a perfectly normal, healthy girl. Bruce's parents, desperate and scared, agreed. At the age of 22 months, Bruce was surgically castrated and renamed Brenda. From that day forward, everyone around her was told she was a girl. But Brenda never felt like one. Even in early childhood, she pushed back against the gender role that had been assigned to her. She refused dresses. She insisted on playing with her brother's toys. She preferred the company of boys and was frequently aggressive, behavior her doctors dismissed as tomboyish. But the resistance only grew stronger. Dr. Money had arranged for annual visits with the twins, Bruce and his brother Brian, as part of an ongoing case study. He documented everything, always claiming success. He wrote papers stating that the experiment was working perfectly, that Brenda was developing into a healthy, normal girl. But behind the closed doors of his office, the truth was much darker. During these sessions, Dr. Money forced the children to rehearse gender roles. He asked invasive, sexually explicit questions. He made them simulate sexual behaviors. He claimed it was necessary to help them understand gender identity. In reality, it was psychological abuse, and it didn't work. By adolescence, Brenda was deeply depressed. She didn't fit in at school. She didn't feel comfortable in her body. She was confused, isolated, and increasingly suicidal. At age 14, she told her parents she would kill herself if she had to see Dr. Money again. That's when they finally told her the truth. She wasn't born a girl, she was Bruce, and everything she had been told since she could speak, her name, her identity, her body, was a lie. After learning the truth, Bruce made a decision. He rejected the identity that had been forced on him and began transitioning back to male. He took the name David Reimer, started hormone therapy, and underwent multiple surgeries to try to reconstruct what had been taken from him. But the damage had already been done, emotionally, psychologically, socially. David tried to build a new life. He married. He spoke out publicly about his story, hoping it could serve as a warning to others. In the late 1990s, journalist John Colapinto published a full account of the case, exposing Dr. Money's cover-up and the ethical horrors behind the so-called success story. But the trauma followed David. His twin brother Brian, who had also suffered under the experiment's shadow, developed schizophrenia and died of an overdose. 2 years later, in 2004, David Reimer took his own life. He was 38 years old. The David Reimer case is one of the most chilling examples of what can happen when theory becomes more important than truth. Dr. Money was never criminally charged. In academic circles, some still cite his early theories as foundational, but the reality of what he did is clear. He used a child to prove a point. He ignored pain in favor of publishing papers, and he refused to admit that his experiment had failed, even as the subject of that experiment broke down in front of him. This wasn't just bad science, it was ideology disguised as medicine. David Reimer's story shattered the myth that gender identity can be molded like clay. It showed that the mind resists manipulation, that biology is not so easily rewritten, and that the cost of ignoring a person's inner truth can be devastating. And what makes it worse is this: none of it had to happen. There was no need to experiment, no reason to turn a tragedy into a test. But because one man believed he could shape identity from the outside in, a child was forced to live a life that was never his. And when he tried to reclaim it, he found it was already too late. Electroshock therapy experiments. The setup was simple: a chair, a few straps, electrodes placed on the head, a machine humming quietly in the corner, then a switch, and a body jolting violently. This was not punishment, not torture in the legal sense. It was called treatment. From the 1930s through the 1960s, and even far beyond, electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, was used in psychiatric hospitals across the world. It was seen as a miracle cure by some. By others, a convenient way to control the unmanageable. But behind the clinical language and institutional approval, the reality was far more disturbing. Electroshock therapy works on a basic principle. By sending an electrical current through the brain, a seizure is induced. The brain resets, like flipping a breaker in a malfunctioning system. That's the theory. In practice, things were never so clean. In the early decades of ECT, the treatment was crude, brutal, often administered without anesthesia, without muscle relaxants, and without patient consent. Patients, many of them institutionalized against their will, were strapped to beds, heads shaved, electrodes attached. The current was turned on. Their bodies convulsed violently. Bones fractured, teeth shattered. Memory loss was immediate and sometimes permanent. But that wasn't seen as a problem, because ECT wasn't just used for depression, it was used on schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, anxiety, homosexuality, postpartum mood changes, and even disobedience. In some institutions, it was used to punish patients who were seen as disruptive. It was used to quiet those who asked too many questions or resisted authority. In extreme cases, it was given repeatedly, 3 times a week. Sometimes more. Patients didn't get better. They got quieter, slower, emptier. One of the most infamous examples was at Chelmsford Hospital in Australia, where ECT was combined with deep sedation. Patients were put into drug-induced comas for weeks, While receiving shocks regularly, at least 24 patients died. Many others were permanently brain damaged. Another shocking case came from Bellevue Hospital in New York, where homeless individuals and alcoholics were taken in under the guise of care, only to be subjected to experimental ECT protocols. Many couldn't recall why they were there. Some couldn't even remember their names after the treatment. In some studies, researchers experimented with bilateral versus unilateral shocks, varying voltages, duration of current, and even multiple daily sessions, as if the brain were just a machine to calibrate. But brains don't forget trauma. Many survivors of early ECT describe their experience the same way: waking up in confusion, memories wiped, personality altered, a hollow sense of self. The treatment may have calmed some symptoms, but it often came at the cost of identity. It's important to note, modern ECT is different. Today, it is performed under anesthesia, with careful dosing, and often provides relief to patients with severe, treatment-resistant depression. But that evolution came after decades of abuse, neglect, and experimentation on the most vulnerable. The tragedy of ECT isn't just that it was used, it's how it was used. And who it was used on. The patients weren't always dangerous. Many were simply unwanted. Wives whose husbands considered them too emotional. Young women labeled hysterical. Elderly patients who grew confused or sad. Children who misbehaved. People with no family, no voice, and no legal recourse. They entered institutions seeking help, or were put there without choice. They were told they were sick, that the doctors knew best, and then they were taken to the chair. Some return changed. Others never came back at all. What makes this history so chilling is not just the pain it caused, but how ordinary it became. The equipment was in hospitals. The procedures were scheduled like routine checkups. The language was sterile: electroconvulsive session, post-treatment monitoring, mild memory loss. But the reality was often a nightmare. Convulsions that shattered bones, screams behind closed doors, blank stares after dozens of sessions, families who visited and found strangers wearing the faces of loved ones. And all of it was legal, approved, funded, and documented in neat, typed case reports. For decades, no one asked why. Because the patients couldn't answer. They were too sedated, too broken, or simply dismissed as insane. The story of electroshock therapy is not about whether the brain can be changed by force. It can. That much is proven. The real question is what happens when we confuse control for care, when silence is mistaken for healing, when the absence of rebellion is seen as recovery. In the end, the shock chair wasn't just a tool of medicine. It was a reminder that in the wrong hands, science can become silence, and silence can look like success until you look closer. Gay aversion therapy. There was a time not long ago when being gay was considered a sickness, a disorder, a problem to be fixed, and the medical system had a solution. They called it aversion therapy. What it actually was torture. In the mid-20th century, especially from the 1940s to the 1970s, psychologists and doctors across the US, the UK, Canada, and other parts of the world ran systematic efforts to cure homosexuality, not with counseling, not with compassion, but with force and electricity. Gay men, many of them young, isolated and afraid, were subjected to procedures designed to create associations between same-sex attraction and pain, fear, disgust, or humiliation. The logic was simple. If a person felt enough suffering every time they experienced attraction, the brain would learn to reject that feeling. This was behavioral psychology turned weapon. One of the most common methods was electroshock aversion therapy. The process was clinical. The subject was strapped into a chair. Electrodes were placed on their arms, fingers, or sometimes directly on their genitals. They were shown a series of images, some of men, some of women. When a picture of a man appeared, someone the patient might find attractive, they were shocked, sometimes mildly, sometimes severely. The patient would flinch, gasp, sometimes cry out. Then the technician would switch the image, show a woman, no shock, then back to a man, another jolt. The cycle repeated, again and again, session after session. This was how the brain was supposed to learn, through pain. Some programs added chemical aversion therapy. Here, patients were given powerful drugs, like apomorphine, that induced violent nausea. While vomiting uncontrollably, they were forced to view images of same-sex affection. The goal was to make their natural attraction physically sickening. Some were told to hold their vomit in until the therapist gave permission to release. It was a form of psychological control, conditioning the body and mind to reject desire as something filthy. In other cases, patients were forced to masturbate to images of women while being shown pictures of men immediately afterward, interrupted, shamed, punished. The line between science and cruelty vanished quickly. What makes all of this worse is that many patients didn't volunteer. Some were sent by courts. Some were committed by families. Some were military personnel facing expulsion unless they agreed to treatment. Others were teenagers, brought in by parents who believed what the newspapers and medical journals said, that homosexuality was deviant, diseased, fixable. But no one got better. What they got was trauma, long-term psychological damage, loss of identity, depression, guilt, suicide. Many survivors of these programs describe deep emotional scars, relationships ruined, trust shattered, bodies trained to flinch at intimacy, minds conditioned to hate themselves. The programs were often backed by state funding, hospitals, prestigious universities, government agencies, even major religious institutions. And in many cases, therapists truly believed they were helping. They weren't. They were enforcing a lie that said love could be rewired, that desire could be punished out of existence, that biology could be bullied into submission. And for decades, it worked, not because it changed anyone's orientation, but because it convinced them to stay silent, to hide, to pretend, to live in fear of who they were. One of the most disturbing chapters came from the UK, where the military ran aversion programs to purge gay soldiers. In one case, men were promised treatment to restore their masculinity. What they got was weeks of isolation, electric shocks, nausea drugs, and psychological warfare. Some left hospitals worse than when they arrived. Some never left at all. The story of gay aversion therapy isn't just about bad science. It's about how authority can be used to reshape reality, to convince someone that their identity is a sickness, and that the pain inflicted on them is actually their cure. Even today, so-called conversion therapy still exists in some parts of the world, often under different names, disguised as spiritual counseling, family intervention, or alternative healing. But at its core, it's the same tool using shame, fear, and pain to erase who someone is. Science eventually caught up. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders. But by then, the damage had been done. Thousands had already passed through clinics, chairs, and locked rooms where their only crime was being themselves. And when they cried out from the shocks, or from the nausea, or from the loneliness, they were told it was part of the process, that this would make them better. But the truth is simple: they weren't broken, the system was. Unit 731. In most war stories, the enemy is armed. They fight, they shoot, they resist. But in this one, they didn't even know they were part of a war. They were prisoners, civilians, children, and they were used as living test subjects in one of the most horrifying scientific programs the world has ever known. This is the story of Unit 731. Between 1936 and 1945, in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, the Imperial Japanese Army ran a top-secret research facility under the cover name Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. In reality, it was a center for biological warfare research. It was led by a man named Sharu Ishii, a brilliant, ambitious, and utterly ruthless microbiologist. Ishii believed that Japan could become militarily unstoppable if it could master the use of plague, cholera, anthrax, and gas-based weapons. But to do that, he needed human data, and so he built Unit 731. The facility was massive, spanning over 6 square kilometers, with multiple buildings, underground labs, incinerators, and execution chambers. It looked like a military compound. but inside, it was a slaughterhouse in disguise. Tens of thousands of people, mostly Chinese civilians, but also Russians, Koreans, Mongolians, and a small number of Allied prisoners of war, were taken to Unit 731. Few ever left. They were referred to by researchers not as patients, not even as prisoners, but as maruta, a Japanese word that means logs, because to the staff, that's all they were. Bodies to be used, burned, disposed of. The experiments were beyond comprehension. Subjects were deliberately infected with deadly pathogens, plague, typhoid, tularemia, cholera, injected directly into their bloodstream. Others were forced to drink water laced with bacteria, or were exposed through open wounds to study how the diseases spread. Some were vivisected alive, cut open without anesthesia, so researchers could observe the effects of disease on living organs. They wanted to see how lungs decayed from pneumonia, how the liver swelled with infection, how the stomach lining collapsed under ulcers. They didn't wait for death. They wanted to watch the process in real time. In other cases, subjects were tied down and exposed to freezing temperatures, limbs submerged in ice water or left outside in the winter until they froze solid. Then, their limbs were beaten with sticks to test for sound changes in frozen flesh. The goal was to study frostbite, to learn the exact moment living tissue becomes irreversibly dead. There were rape experiments, forced pregnancies, tests on infants and toddlers, blood replacement trials where animal blood was transfused into humans. Every boundary was crossed. And then there were the gas chambers. In sealed rooms, subjects were exposed to chemical weapons, mustard gas, phosgene, cyanide, sometimes individually, sometimes in groups. The scientists recorded how long it took to lose consciousness, what organs failed first, and what dosage caused death in the shortest time. Everything was noted. Everything was timed. This was not madness. It was method. One of the most chilling aspects of Unit 731 is how ordinary it looked on paper. Researchers wore lab coats. They used clipboards. They used timers and microscopes and medical equipment. They wrote academic reports. It wasn't chaotic torture. It was organized science, just without humanity. Shiroishi justified it all in the name of national survival. If these experiments could help Japan develop weapons that ended the war quickly, he argued, then the cost, human or not, was worth it. By the time Unit 731 was dismantled in 1945, it had conducted experiments on an estimated 10,000 to 12,000 people, not including the victims of field tests in surrounding villages, where bombs filled with plague-infested fleas were dropped from planes. Entire communities were wiped out just to test delivery methods. And then, it disappeared. When Japan surrendered, the US government made a choice. Instead of prosecuting Ishii and his team for war crimes, they granted them immunity in exchange for their research. The data was seen as valuable, uniquely horrifying, yes, but too useful to destroy. None of the senior scientists at Unit 731 were tried at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Most lived out their lives in peace. Some became professors. Others worked in industry. Shuro Ishii died of throat cancer in 1959. Never punished. The victims were never acknowledged. No apology. No compensation. Not even a grave marker for most. Their names are lost. Their bodies incinerated. Their organs pickled in jars, destroyed, or sealed away in archives. The story of Unit 731 forces us to confront a truth that science rarely wants to admit. That knowledge by itself is not good. That a white coat does not equal morality. That a lab can become a torture chamber. The moment you remove consent, ethics, and empathy. Unit 731 wasn't about madness. It was about control, precision, and the belief that progress justifies pain. It was science stripped of soul. And in the echo of those gas rooms, we're left with one question. What is the line between research and evil, and how many people must die before we admit we crossed it? Genie the feral child. In 1970, Los Angeles authorities entered a small suburban house following a report of suspected child neglect. What they found inside was not a child's room, not a family home, but something closer to a prison cell. There, Crouched in the corner was a 13-year-old girl. Her arms and legs were thin. Her eyes avoided contact. She made no sound. She had been kept in near total isolation for over a decade. Her name wasn't really Genie. That was the name researchers gave her. Her real name was never released to the public. To this day, most people only know her as the feral child. From the moment she was born, Genie's life had been controlled by fear, by silence, and by her father. He believed she was mentally disabled and decided to protect her from the outside world by keeping her locked in a single room, almost entirely alone. For 13 years, Genie spent most of her time tied to a child's potty chair, immobile, or strapped into a crib with her arms and legs bound. The room was always dark. The only human voices she heard were angry ones. She was beaten for making noise. She learned quickly to stay silent. When authorities rescued her, she couldn't speak. She could barely walk. She spat when angry and clawed at herself when upset. Doctors and psychologists were stunned. It wasn't just abuse, it was sensory and linguistic deprivation. Genie had missed what experts call the critical period for language acquisition. According to linguistic theory, if a child doesn't learn language by a certain age, roughly before puberty, the brain loses its ability to fully develop linguistic structure. Genie was living proof. And so, the scientists came. At first, Genie was treated with compassion. She was brought to a hospital where a team of linguists, psychologists, and neurologists began working with her. They saw her as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to study how language develops, or fails to develop, without early exposure. She was tested daily, studied, recorded. Every word she learned, every gesture, every facial movement was logged. She became the subject of academic papers, documentaries, grant applications. But as interest in her grew, so did the pressure to produce results. Researchers began to focus less on Genie as a person and more on Genie as a case. They pushed her into multiple foster homes, where she was sometimes mistreated again. Her original caretakers, including scientists she had bonded with, were cut off due to legal and funding disputes. In one home, she was punished for vomiting and regressed rapidly. The fragile progress she had made, smiling, trusting, trying to speak, began to vanish. There was no consistency, no long-term plan. She was passed between psychologists, linguists, social workers, each with their own theories, their own goals. Genie stopped talking, not because she couldn't, but because she lost the will. The child who had been rescued from silence was pushed back into it, this time by the very people who claimed to be helping. The Genie case became a symbol, not just of linguistic isolation, but of scientific exploitation. The studies failed to provide a clear answer to the critical period hypothesis, but they did prove something else, that when researchers become too focused on the data, they can forget the human being behind the chart. Genie never fully recovered. As of the last public reports, she was living in a private care facility in California, her condition undisclosed. The little girl whose silence once captivated the academic world was left in silence once again. She wasn't a wild child. She wasn't an animal. She was a girl, abused, neglected, then studied until she broke. What should have been a story of healing became one of extraction. What could have been a chance to protect a child became a competition for scientific prestige. And what's left is the image of a broken girl, wide-eyed and silent, used as a mirror to answer academic questions. But no one asked the question that mattered most. What does she need? Harlow's isolation experiments. In the 1950s and 60s, at a university lab in Wisconsin, a series of experiments were carried out that would become some of the most disturbing in the history of psychology. The subjects weren't criminals or volunteers. They were infant monkeys, separated from their mothers and raised in steel cages, surrounded by silence, and studied by a man who wanted to understand love by first removing it. His name was Harlow. At the time, psychologists were obsessed with behaviorism, treating emotion like a chemical reaction, and love like an unnecessary luxury. Many believed that affection, especially between a mother and child, was secondary to basic needs like food and warmth. Harlow disagreed. He believed love was a psychological necessity, but to prove it, He had to build a world where love was completely absent. The monkeys were taken from their mothers hours after birth. They were placed alone in cages with no physical contact, no social interaction, and no soft surfaces. In one experiment, they were given two fake mothers, one made of cold wire that provided milk, and another made of soft cloth that offered no food. The result was clear. The infants clung to the cloth mother for hours, choosing comfort over nourishment. This, Harlow said, proved that love, at least the need for physical affection, was more fundamental than food itself. But that was just the beginning. The real horror came in what he called the pit of despair. That was the actual name he gave it. It was a small vertical chamber, made of stainless steel, with walls that sloped inward to prevent escape. Once a monkey was placed inside, it couldn't see anything but its own reflection. There was no light, no sound, no warmth, just a steel floor, a closed top, and time. The monkeys were locked inside for days, sometimes weeks. Some sat frozen, some rocked back and forth, some tore at their own fur, and some stopped moving altogether. When they were finally released, most of them never recovered. They didn't socialize. They didn't respond to touch. They didn't seek affection. They stared into corners. They rejected other monkeys. Some stopped eating. Others died within days of being freed. Harlow had managed to simulate what he called clinical depression in a creature that once sought nothing but connection. The deeper he went, the darker it got. In later experiments, he introduced what he called rape racks, mechanical devices used to forcibly mate the female monkeys that had been previously isolated. He wanted to see if maternal instincts could override the damage. They couldn't. Many of the mothers ignored their babies. Some abused them. One crushed her infant's skull against the floor. Others let their offspring starve. It wasn't just that the monkeys had changed. It was that something had been erased. The ability to love had been removed, and nothing took its place. Harlow's research was widely published. His findings helped shape early understandings of attachment theory, child development, and mental illness. But at what cost? He was hailed as a pioneer, even as critics called his work monstrous. He seemed unbothered. He once said, "I don't think I tortured any animals. We did what had to be done." But what had to be done? Could love only be proven by its absence? Could we only understand affection by first building a world without it? The infant monkeys in Harlow's lab didn't just show us the importance of love. They showed us what happens when it's removed completely. They showed us that emotional damage is not abstract, it's measurable, visible, and often permanent. And perhaps most haunting of all, they showed us how far someone will go in the name of science, if no one tells them to stop. Pain threshold experiments. In a quiet laboratory, far from any battlefield, a different kind of war was being waged, not with bullets or bombs, but with wires, switches, and the gradual unraveling of human tolerance. It was the 1950s, and psychologists were still trying to understand one of the most fundamental questions in human behavior: how much pain can a person endure before they break? To find out, they turned to electricity. Pain threshold experiments became a focal point in psychology and military research. The premise was deceptively simple. Apply increasing levels of electric shock to a subject and observe how they respond. But the real objective was far more complex. Scientists wanted to study fear, compliance, resistance, control. They wanted to see how pain could be used, not just to hurt, but to influence. Participants were often told they were part of a study on memory, learning, or reflexes. Electrodes were attached to their skin, usually on the arms or hands. In some cases, they were asked to press a button that would deliver a shock to another subject. In others, they were the ones being shocked. The voltage was slowly increased over time. The reactions were measured: twitching, flinching, verbal protests, pleas to stop. But the experiments didn't always stop when the subjects asked. In some trials, pain was applied not just as a stimulus, but as a form of psychological leverage. Subjects were asked questions, and if they answered incorrectly or too slowly, they were shocked. Over time, the fear of the next shock became worse than the shock itself. Anticipation replaced pain, Anxiety became the true weapon. There were tests conducted where subjects were restrained to prevent them from pulling away. In one experiment, individuals were told they could stop the procedure at any time. But each time they tried, the researcher in the white coat encouraged them, just one more round. You're doing fine. Many continued long past the point of visible distress, not because they wanted to, but because someone in authority told them it was necessary. What made these experiments especially disturbing was the clinical environment. There were no raised voices, no threats, just sterile instructions, calm voices, and the slow, methodical turning of dials. It didn't look like torture, but to the person in the chair, it felt like it. The experiments varied in design. In some, the pain was predictable, same voltage, same location. In others, it was randomized. Sometimes the shocks were mild, barely more than a static buzz. Other times, they caused full muscle contractions and left welts on the skin. Researchers watched with notebooks in hand. They observed how long it took for someone to break, to cry, to beg. The ethical justification was always the same. It's for science, to understand behavior, to prevent future suffering. But that didn't change the fact that people were hurt, intentionally, repeatedly, and often without a clear understanding of what they had signed up for. The legacy of these shock experiments is complicated. On one hand, they provided data that would influence safety standards, medical practices, and our understanding of trauma. On the other hand, they served as a blueprint for psychological control, information that would later be used in interrogation techniques and behavioral conditioning. The shock machine wasn't about violence in the traditional sense. It wasn't about causing visible wounds. It was about using discomfort to erode autonomy, about turning pain into compliance, about discovering the precise moment when a human being stops resisting, not because they are forced, but because they believe they have no choice. It's easy to say you'd never let it happen to you. But history shows us again and again, put a person in a room, give someone else a lab coat and a clipboard, and you might be shocked at how far they'll go. Sensory deprivation studies. In the 1950s, researchers wanted to understand what happens when the human mind is deprived not of food or water or sleep, but of stimulation itself. What if you took away light, sound, movement, human contact? What if you placed someone into an environment so empty, so silent, so featureless, that the brain had nothing left to process? Would they relax? Would they break? That question became the basis for a series of experiments in sensory deprivation, a term that would come to represent one of the most psychologically disorienting conditions ever studied. At McGill University in Canada, psychologist Donald Hebb led one of the earliest and most infamous studies. The setup was simple but precise. Volunteer subjects, usually healthy college students, were paid to lie in specially designed cubicles for hours at a time. Their arms and legs were fitted with soft foam to prevent movement. Their hands were covered with cardboard tubes. Their eyes were blocked with opaque goggles. White noise played constantly through headphones to drown out all external sound. There was no clock, no conversation, no books, no color, no sense of passing time. The effects began quickly. Within a few hours, subjects began to feel restless. Their minds drifted. They reported difficulty focusing. Some imagined they heard sounds that weren't there. Voices, knocks, whispers. After one day, the hallucinations began. Many saw flashing lights or geometric patterns. Some saw faces. One man reported seeing thousands of squirrels marching across a snowy field. Another saw a procession of eyeless people. The images weren't just visual. They felt real. The subjects couldn't tell whether they were awake or dreaming. And yet, these were not sick or unstable people. They were students, volunteers, people who had simply been left alone for too long with nothing to anchor their senses. By the second or third day, most participants were begging to stop. They became emotionally unstable, angry, tearful, confused. Their thinking slowed. Some had trouble speaking in full sentences. Others developed an intense sensitivity to light and sound. Just re-entering a normal room overwhelmed them. The experiment was scheduled for several days, but almost no one made it past 72 hours. The brain simply couldn't handle the emptiness. The researchers concluded that sensory input was not optional. It was essential. The mind needs stimulation the way the body needs oxygen. But not everyone took that lesson as a warning. Decades later, sensory deprivation techniques, refined and stripped of scientific concern, would be used in military prisons and interrogation rooms. In CIA black sites, prisoners were placed in windowless rooms, hands and feet restrained, hoods over their heads, loud white noise or mechanical buzzing pumped into their ears. Sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. The goal wasn't to gather information, it was to break the mind, and it worked. Victims became disoriented. Their sense of time and identity collapsed. Many began confessing to things they didn't do, agreeing to anything just to escape the void. What began as a curiosity in a university lab evolved into a weapon of psychological warfare. Even in modern therapeutic settings, so-called isolation tanks, also known as float tanks, are used for relaxation and introspection. But the line between therapy and trauma is thinner than it appears. For some, the silence is calming. For others, it opens a door the brain was never meant to walk through. Because sensory deprivation doesn't just remove noise, it removes context. It takes away the map your brain uses to understand the world, and when that map is gone, the mind doesn't go blank. It builds something else, a replacement reality. A world of hallucinations, echoes, fragments. And once the door to that world opens, there's no guarantee it can be closed again. Neubauer twins study. In the early 1960s, inside a New York adoption agency, something unsettling was happening behind closed doors. Infants, newborn, healthy, and ready for adoption, were being quietly separated. Not for logistical reasons, not due to a lack of foster homes, but by design. Because someone had decided that these children were worth more if they were raised apart. Specifically, if they were twins. This is the story of the Neubauer twins study. A psychological experiment, so secretive, so ethically murky, that its full scope remained hidden for decades. The goal was to study the old question of nature versus nurture. Do genetics determine who we become, or does our environment shape us? And what better way, they thought, to test this than to raise identical twins in completely different homes, without ever telling them they had a sibling. It was the brainchild of Austrian-born psychiatrist Peter Neubauer, who partnered with the Louise Wise Adoption Agency in New York. The agency specialized in placing Jewish children with Jewish families, and Neubauer saw an opportunity to secretly divide twins, place each child in a different type of home, wealthy or working class, strict or permissive, urban or suburban, and track how their personalities evolved. But there was a catch. The families were never told their child had a twin. They believed they were adopting a single baby. In reality, a team of psychologists had already begun observing them. Children were brought in for regular testing, IQ exams, handwriting analysis, motor skills assessments. Researchers filmed them through one-way glass, took notes on their behavior, tracked how they walked, talked, and responded to strangers. The same was done to the twin they never knew existed, just a few miles away, growing up in a different world. Over the years, the researchers collected thousands of pages of data, but the children, the subjects, were kept in the dark. So were the parents. There was no consent, no briefing, no mention of a study. It wasn't until the late 1970s that the truth began to crack open, by accident. 3 young men, Edward Galland, David Kellman, and Robert Shafran, discovered at age 19 that they were identical triplets who had been separated at birth and adopted by different families. Their reunion made headlines. The media called it heartwarming, incredible, a miracle. But behind the smiles and celebrations, something felt off. Why had no one told them? Why had they been studied? And were there others? As the triplets searched for answers, they uncovered the existence of the secret twin study. They weren't the only ones. Other sets of twins, now adults, began learning the truth about their past. That their separation wasn't a tragic oversight. It was an experiment. One that used their lives as data. The study was never published. Neubauer's team never released the findings. The data was sealed at Yale University until 2065. Even today, those affected can only access a portion of their own files, heavily redacted. No official apology was issued, no compensation offered. The reason? Researchers claimed the data was inconclusive, that the study had been complicated, that the science didn't go as planned, but the damage wasn't statistical, it was personal. Many of the separated twins and triplets suffered from depression, anxiety, identity confusion, and in some cases, suicidal thoughts. Some were raised in unstable homes. Some felt something missing their entire lives but never knew why. One of the triplets, Edward Galland, died by suicide in 1995. What made the experiment so disturbing wasn't just the secrecy, it was the coldness. The children were viewed not as people, but as control groups. Their homes were chosen for contrast. Their personalities were observed like variables. The fact that they were siblings, living parallel lives without each other, was treated as a feature, not a tragedy. Even when the researchers saw signs of distress, behavioral issues, emotional struggles, they didn't intervene. They simply recorded the symptoms, like doctors watching a wound fester without offering a bandage. And all of it was hidden behind smiles, adoption papers, and the illusion of family. The monster twins experiment revealed a dark side of scientific curiosity, the willingness to divide lives in the name of insight, to create loneliness in order to observe its effects, to separate what nature had joined, just to see what nurture would do next. It's one thing to study the human mind, it's another to gamble with human connection. Brain stimulation of rats. In the 1950s, deep beneath the surface of everyday science, researchers began exploring not just how the brain thinks, but how it could be controlled. Not through words or conditioning, but through wires, electricity, and direct access to the mind's internal machinery. One of the most influential and eerie pioneers in this space was Dr. José Delgado, a Spanish-born neuroscientist who believed that behavior could be influenced, maybe even overwritten, by precise electrical stimulation of the brain. And to prove it, he turned to rats. In Delgado's lab, rats were surgically implanted with tiny electrodes in very specific regions of their brains. Each wire was carefully inserted, not randomly, but into areas associated with movement, reward, aggression, and fear. These weren't just sensors, they were remote control points. By sending small electric pulses through the wires, Delgado could trigger specific reactions. A rat would walk in circles, freeze in place, twitch uncontrollably, or suddenly press a lever again and again. But the most shocking result came when he found that by stimulating the septal region, a part of the brain tied to pleasure and reward, rats would self-stimulate obsessively. In one experiment, a rat was placed in a cage with a lever. Every time it pressed the lever, a jolt of electricity would stimulate its pleasure center. The result? The rat pressed the lever thousands of times per hour, ignoring food, water, and rest, sometimes until it collapsed from exhaustion. The animal wasn't just being manipulated, it was addicted to its own brain. Delgado's experiments didn't stop with rats. He implanted electrodes in monkeys, cats, and eventually humans too, patients undergoing brain surgery for epilepsy or other conditions. In one famous demonstration, he stood in the middle of a bull ring with a charging bull bearing down on him. At the last moment, he pushed a button on a remote control. The bull stopped mid-charge, not because it was afraid, but because the electrical signal disrupted the aggression center of its brain. It looked like science fiction. It felt like mind control, but Delgado didn't see it that way. He believed his work could cure mental illness, reduce violence, even eliminate criminal behavior. He dreamed of a future where surgeons and psychiatrists could rewire behavior with nothing more than electrodes and a remote. But his critics were less optimistic, because what these experiments revealed wasn't just how behavior could be influenced, but how fragile free will might be. These rats weren't being taught. They weren't being convinced, they were being commanded. Their decisions reduced to circuits and voltage. And if it could be done to rats and bulls and eventually humans, then where is the line? At what point does treatment become control? Delgado once said, "We need a program of psychosurgery for political control of our society." He later walked back that comment, but the fear remained. That one day, wires in the brain wouldn't be a tool for healing, but a lever to pull, in the hands of someone with power. The rats with wires didn't know they were being controlled. They just pressed the lever again, and again, and again. Operation Midnight Climax, MK-Ultra. In the early 1950s, the CIA was no longer just collecting secrets. It was trying to control them. Mind control, real, functioning, behavioral control, became the new obsession inside its most secretive program, MK-Ultra. But one subproject took the darkness even further. It combined LSD, surveillance, and sexual manipulation, hidden behind fake curtains and one-way mirrors. It was called Operation Midnight Climax. The setup sounds like fiction, but it wasn't. The CIA rented out safe houses in San Francisco and later New York City. From the outside, they looked like ordinary apartments. Inside, they were surveillance traps. The windows were sealed. The walls were bugged. Behind a mirrored glass, a CIA agent would sit for hours, sipping whiskey, watching strangers lose their grip on reality. Here's how it worked. The CIA hired sex workers to lure unsuspecting men back to the safe houses. These men, often chosen for their isolation, their vulnerability, or just their bad luck, believed they were paying for a night of intimacy. They didn't know they were walking into an experiment. Without their consent or knowledge, they were dosed with LSD. Sometimes the drugs were slipped into drinks, other times into cigarettes or food. Within minutes, the effects would take hold. Colors warped, thoughts spiraled, time stretched into hallucinations. Some became paranoid, others euphoric, a few broke down entirely. And the whole time, someone was watching. The agents observed from behind mirrored glass, recording every word, every touch, every breakdown. They weren't just interested in the drug's effects. They wanted to see how LSD altered trust, resistance, and sexual behavior. Could a person be more easily manipulated when high? Could they be persuaded to talk, to confess, to obey? The answers weren't clean. The results weren't scientific. But that didn't matter, because the point was never just research. It was control. CIA operatives called it the most fun they'd ever had. The safe houses weren't just laboratories. They were playgrounds. Agents would drink while on the job, make jokes through the speaker system, and mock the men they were studying. It was exploitation under the thin veil of intelligence work. No paperwork, no accountability, no ethics. Some victims were repeat targets. Others never knew what had happened to them. There were no warnings, no follow-up. Many likely left those apartments believing they had simply gone mad for one night. Others may have never recovered. And this wasn't a rogue experiment. It was overseen by George White, a narcotics officer turned CIA operative. White kept detailed diaries, casually writing about how much he enjoyed the power. In one entry he wrote, "Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" The CIA didn't stop Operation Midnight Climax after a week or a month. It ran for nearly a decade. Eventually, internal pressure and shifting politics shut it down. But, by then, hundreds of people had been unknowingly dosed and observed. Many were left psychologically damaged. Some disappeared. None were ever officially acknowledged. Operation Midnight Climax was buried under layers of denial and redacted reports. Most details didn't emerge until the 1970s, when congressional investigations into CIA abuses began tearing open decades of hidden files. Even then, much of what happened remains classified or lost. The name itself, Midnight Climax, sounds like a cruel joke. And that's exactly what it was. A weaponization of intimacy, a government-funded trap, a program that used sex and psychedelics not to heal minds, but to fracture them, for data, for leverage, and for entertainment. In the end, the victims weren't enemy spies or terrorists. They were ordinary men, strangers looking for connection in a dark city, unknowingly caught in something much darker. They thought they were paying for a night of pleasure. What they got was a trip they never asked for. Dutton and Aron's suspension bridge study. There is a bridge that stretches across the mouth of San Francisco Bay, its red towers rising through the fog like silent sentinels. To the world, the Golden Gate Bridge is a symbol of beauty, an architectural marvel, a postcard-perfect landmark. But to those who know its history, it has another name: the Bridge of No Return. Since its opening in 1937, the Golden Gate Bridge has become one of the most lethal suicide sites in the world. Over the decades, more than 1,700 people have jumped from its edge, plunging 245 feet into the freezing waters below. The fall lasts just 4 seconds. The impact is almost always fatal. For years, the city treated it as a tragic statistic, a quiet tragedy. But not everyone saw it that way. Some researchers saw the bridge as a place to study death, to observe what pushes a person to the edge and what happens in those final moments. Among the most disturbing cases was an unofficial psychological profile project conducted by mental health experts and coroners throughout the mid to late 20th century. After each jump, investigators would collect personal items, notes, and testimonies from family members, trying to build a model of suicidal behavior. But there was one haunting discovery that surfaced over and over. Those who survived the fall, less than 2%, almost always said the same thing. The moment they let go, they regretted it. One survivor said, "The second my hands left the railing, I wanted to live." Another said, "All I could think on the way down was, I hope I survive. I don't want to die." These confessions shook researchers because they revealed that the act of jumping wasn't always rooted in a firm decision. It was often an impulsive moment, a flash of despair, magnified by isolation, silence, and the eerie pull of the bridge itself. And the bridge doesn't just allow jumps, it draws them. The walkways are quiet, the railings are low, and the view, fog, ocean, steel, is vast and empty. People describe the bridge as calling to them, not with sound, but with stillness. In 2003, a document known as the Bridge Rail Foundation report was leaked, revealing that authorities had long known the bridge's suicide statistics, and that engineers had actively debated building barriers for decades. But there were concerns: it would ruin the view, it would be too expensive, it might make the bridge feel less majestic, and so the deaths continued. Over time, the Golden Gate Bridge became more than a structure. It became a case study in public apathy, in the psychology of suicide, and in the failure to act when tragedy becomes routine. But it also became a canvas for one of the darkest experiments in passive observation. What happens when you allow a structure to facilitate death and do nothing? Researchers mapped patterns. People often jumped from similar spots, especially the area just past the South Tower. Some folded their jackets neatly before jumping. Others left notes with heartbreaking clarity. "I'm sorry. This is not your fault. I just want the pain to stop." And in rare cases, people stood for hours, trembling on the edge, until anyone spoke to them. Many of those people lived. That fact led to another revelation: intervention, even brief, often works. Studies showed that just a few moments of human connection, one word, one question, could interrupt the spiral long enough to save a life. Despite that, the bridge remained unchanged for decades. The deaths continued. Tourists passed by, commuters crossed, and beneath them, a silent toll was being collected. No announcement, no sirens, just a body slipping through fog and wind and falling into silence. It wasn't until 2018, after 80 years of deaths, that construction began on a suicide barrier. Not because a single study demanded it, but because public pressure finally outweighed bureaucratic inertia. The barrier is now nearly complete. Steel netting, stretched beneath the deck, designed not to punish, but to catch. But it came too late for thousands. The suicidal bridge is not an experiment in a lab, it's a real place. A public structure that became a quiet accomplice to despair. A place that reflected how society treats mental illness with distance, discomfort, and delay. No electrodes, no wires, no drugs, just silence, and a decision that could have been reversed if someone had acted 1 second sooner. Human radiation experiments. In the shadows of America's atomic age, a series of experiments unfolded that were never announced to the public, never explained to their victims, and never meant to be discovered. These were not battlefield tests or lab simulations. These were human radiation experiments, carried out on civilians without consent, inside hospitals, universities, and even military bases. They began in the 1940s as part of the Manhattan Project and its aftermath. As scientists raced to build nuclear weapons, a terrifying question lingered in the background. What does radiation actually do to the human body? Not in theory, not in rats, but in real people. And so, a plan was born. Doctors and scientists, backed by the Atomic Energy Commission and the Department of Defense, began secretly injecting radioactive materials, including plutonium, uranium, and polonium, into unsuspecting patients. They were told it was treatment, a vitamin shot, a new diagnostic test. In reality, it was an experiment in internal contamination. The most infamous cases involved plutonium injections. Between 1945 and 1947, at least 18 patients were injected with micrograms of plutonium at hospitals in Chicago, Rochester, and San Francisco. Most were poor, elderly, or seriously ill. People unlikely to ask questions and unlikely to live long enough to expose what had been done. One of the earliest victims was a man referred to in documents only as patient Cal 1. He was a 58-year-old laborer hospitalized after a car accident. While unconscious, he was injected with plutonium without his knowledge. The researchers monitored his urine and blood for weeks, analyzing how long the radioactive material stayed in his body. They followed him for the rest of his life. He died years later, never knowing he had been used as a test subject in a nuclear experiment. But plutonium wasn't the only danger. In other studies, pregnant women were given radioactive iron to study how it crossed the placenta. The women were told it was a nutritional supplement. Their babies became data points. In Massachusetts, mentally disabled children at a state school were fed radioactive oatmeal, sponsored by a private breakfast company working with government scientists. The children were told they were joining a science club. They had no idea they were ingesting materials that could damage their DNA. Prisoners were also targeted. In Washington State and Oregon, inmates were given testicular radiation to study the long-term effects on fertility. Many of these men later became infertile. Some developed tumors. None were fully informed about the risks. There were over 4,000 radiation experiments conducted between the 1940s and 1970s. Many were small, and few were massive. All shared a common thread: lack of consent. The justification was always the same: national security, scientific advancement, the greater good. But the people used in these tests weren't soldiers. They weren't volunteers. They were civilians, patients, children, prisoners, people who trusted the doctors in front of them, people who believed the white coats meant safety. Instead, they were dosed with materials that could alter their genes, compromise their immune systems, and quietly erode their health for decades. The truth didn't come to light until the 1990s. A journalist's investigation led to a federal inquiry. The Clinton administration formed the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, which finally acknowledged what had been done. Reports were released, apologies were made, but the damage had already been done. Many of the victims had already died. Others were too sick to benefit from any justice, and some never learned the truth at all. Just a lifetime of unexplained illness, infertility, or slow creeping decline. The human radiation experiments were not isolated incidents. They were a reflection of what happens when fear and secrecy override ethics, when scientific ambition forgets that the body in the hospital bed isn't a sample, it's a person. These experiments didn't require war zones or foreign enemies. They didn't need torture chambers. Just a syringe, a clipboard, and silence. Injected with plutonium, observed like specimens, and buried in redacted files while the fallout sank deep into the blood of the living. Nazi medical experiments. It didn't happen in secret. It happened under banners and uniforms, in buildings marked with swastikas, under the approval of doctors, professors, and military officials. The Nazi medical experiments weren't hidden from history. They were documented, photographed, and even published. because the people who conducted them didn't believe they were doing something wrong. They believed they were making progress. The experiments took place between 1939 and 1945, inside concentration camps across Nazi-occupied Europe. Auschwitz, Dachau, Ravensbrück, Buchenwald, names now synonymous with horror, became not only death camps, but laboratories of inhumanity. The victims were Jews, Romani, Poles, disabled people, prisoners of war, and children. They were selected without consent. They were not sick, they were not volunteers. They were simply categorized by race, by health, by usefulness, and then used. One category of experiments focused on survival and endurance. At Dachau, prisoners were submerged in ice water for hours to study hypothermia. Researchers recorded how long it took for them to lose consciousness, to stop shivering, to die. Others were placed in high-altitude chambers, simulating plane crashes at extreme elevations. The air was removed. The pressure dropped. The victims convulsed, foamed at the mouth, and suffocated as scientists took notes through glass. Some prisoners were forced to drink seawater, to study dehydration. Others were deliberately infected with gangrene, tuberculosis, malaria, or typhus, just to test potential treatments. Many were denied food, sleep, or anesthesia. Then there were the experiments in sterilization and racial purification. In Auschwitz, Dr. Karl Kloberg injected chemical compounds into the uteruses of women to block fertility, causing unbearable pain, infection, and internal bleeding. He treated his victims as disposable. Once he was done, they were often killed and dissected to study the damage. Dr. Horst Schumann targeted both men and women, using X-rays to burn the reproductive organs from the inside out. No protection, no anesthesia, just radiation, followed by castration and organ removal to confirm the effectiveness. And then came Joseph Mengele. Known as the Angel of Death, Mengele conducted hundreds of experiments at Auschwitz, most notoriously on twins. Children were measured, photographed, injected with chemicals, subjected to surgeries without anesthesia. One twin might be killed, so the other could be compared in a post-mortem dissection. Eye color was artificially changed using dyes and needles. Limbs were amputated and reattached in different configurations. Internal organs were removed while the children were still alive. He smiled as he worked. Some twins survived. Most did not. Mengele kept meticulous records. He believed he was studying genetics. He believed he was advancing science. But his real goal was to prove that the Aryan race was superior and that all others were expendable. The justification behind every Nazi medical experiment was built on a single idea that some lives were worth less than others. Once that line was accepted, once people became categories instead of individuals, morality no longer mattered. Efficiency did. Data did. Power did. After the war, the world saw the evidence. Photographs, testimonies, scars, corpses. At the Nuremberg trials, 23 doctors and administrators were prosecuted for war crimes. The trial revealed the full extent of what had been done and forced the world to confront the question, what is science without ethics? The outcome led to the creation of the Nuremberg Code, a set of principles for medical research that emphasized voluntary consent, human dignity, and the right to withdraw. It became the foundation of modern medical ethics. But the horror didn't disappear, because the knowledge gained from those experiments, no matter how vile the method, was still there. And in some corners of science, quietly, people asked, should we use it? The debate continues to this day. Some of the data on hypothermia and infectious diseases was considered useful. Some researchers wanted to apply it. Others refused, arguing that using the results would legitimize the atrocities that produced them. But the truth is this: there is no clean knowledge born from cruelty. There is no science that erases suffering. No discovery that justifies what was done to thousands of men, women, and children inside those camps. They weren't volunteers. They were victims. And the men in white coats weren't healers. They were executioners with stethoscopes. Romanian orphanage neglect. In the final years of the Cold War, satellite images showed what the world already suspected. Romania was crumbling. But what no one outside the country could see, what remained hidden behind concrete walls and government propaganda, was a humanitarian crisis of staggering proportions. Inside state-run orphanages across Romania, thousands of children were locked away in filth, silence, and isolation, victims of a government policy that had turned parenting into law and humanity into bureaucracy. This was not an experiment in name, but it became one in practice. In 1966, Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu issued Decree 770B, a law banning contraception and abortion for all women under 40 with fewer than 5 children. His goal was to build a mighty socialist population. Children were no longer seen as individuals. They were raw materials for the state. Birth rates soared. But with poverty on the rise and resources stretched thin, many parents abandoned their children not out of malice, but out of desperation. The government promised care, housing, education. Instead, it delivered warehouses of horror. By the late 1980s, an estimated 170,000 children were living in Romanian orphanages. Many were not orphans at all, just unwanted, unregistered, or unclaimed. And what they endured inside those institutions would haunt generations. Infants were tied to cribs, left in soiled diapers for days, never touched, never spoken to. Bottles were propped up by towels. Feeding was mechanical. Crying was ignored. Silence was enforced not by discipline but by neglect. In some wards, children were kept in metal cages, stacked side by side, row after row, like storage bins. Some had physical disabilities, others had no diagnosis at all, but they were all treated the same, like problems to be stored, not people to be raised. There were no toys, no books, no songs, just concrete walls, the stench of urine, and nurses so overwhelmed, they barely learned the children's names. The damage was catastrophic. When international aid workers and journalists finally entered these orphanages in the early 1990s, after the fall of Ceausescu, they found children who could not speak, could not walk, could not cry. Some stared into space, rocking endlessly. Others screamed when touched. These were not isolated cases. These were entire generations of children, tens of thousands, who had grown up in social and emotional deprivation so extreme that their brains had physically changed. MRI scans later revealed reduced brain volume, underdeveloped frontal lobes, and impaired emotional regulation. In a landmark follow-up study, researchers tracked children adopted from Romanian orphanages into Western families. Those adopted before age 6 months often recovered, but those adopted later, especially after 2 years old, showed lifelong difficulties in cognition, empathy, attachment, and trust. Some developed reactive attachment disorder, unable to form bonds even with loving families. Others struggled with impulse control, learning disabilities, or severe anxiety. Their early environment had rewired their development at the deepest level. These children became accidental case studies, proof of what happens when a child is raised without touch, without talk, without meaning. It wasn't a designed experiment. No university approved it. No government openly recorded it. But in effect, the Romanian orphanage system became one of the largest natural psychological experiments in human history, and its findings were horrifyingly clear. Love isn't optional. Stimulation isn't a luxury. Neglect is a form of violence. Decades later, Romania has worked to reform its system. Many of the worst institutions have been shut down. Foster care and adoption programs have expanded. But scars remain on the bodies of survivors and in the moral record of a nation that turned its own children into prisoners of ideology. The world saw cages, but the real prison was built from silence, neglect, and the belief that a child can grow without being seen. Chinese organ harvesting allegations. For years, whispers circulated through underground channels and human rights reports, allegations so severe they sounded like conspiracy theories. But the stories kept coming. And piece by piece, the outline of something horrifying began to emerge. In China, prisoners of conscience were reportedly being killed, not for punishment, but for their organs, livers, kidneys, corneas, hearts, removed while still fresh. sometimes while the body was still alive. This is the story of forced organ harvesting, a practice denied by officials, but described in painful detail by witnesses, survivors, and a growing number of international investigators. The timeline begins in the late 1990s and early 2000s, as China's transplant industry suddenly and rapidly expanded. Hospitals across the country began advertising incredibly short waiting times for life-saving organ transplants, sometimes a matter of days, compared to months or years in other countries. The question was simple: where were all these organs coming from? Chinese officials initially claimed they were sourced from death row prisoners, but that explanation quickly collapsed under scrutiny. The number of executions didn't match the volume of transplants. There were far too many organs. Then, new testimony began to emerge from doctors, former police, and investigators. They told a different story, one involving prisoners of conscience, including Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan dissidents, house church Christians, and most prominently, Falun Gong practitioners, a spiritual group targeted by the Chinese government since 1999. These groups were imprisoned in massive numbers. Many were never officially charged. They disappeared into camps, re-education centers, and secret detention facilities. And inside those walls, they were reportedly subjected to blood tests, organ scans, and tissue typing, medical exams, with no therapeutic purpose, not to treat them, but to catalog them. Eyewitnesses described how certain prisoners were suddenly taken away and never seen again. Medical professionals from outside China who conducted transplant research were puzzled. How could matches be found so quickly? How could surgeries be scheduled so precisely? Because the matches were already waiting. The victims were alive, healthy, screened in advance, and killed to order. One former surgeon, testifying under a pseudonym, described being forced to remove the liver and kidneys from a prisoner who had been shot in the chest but was still breathing. His heart was beating as the scalpel went in. He died on the operating table, not from execution, but from extraction. International investigators, including a tribunal in London in 2019, concluded that forced organ harvesting has occurred for years and may still be ongoing. The China Tribunal, chaired by Sir Geoffrey Nice, who previously prosecuted war crimes in The Hague, examined years of evidence. Its conclusion was chillingly clear. Forced organ harvesting has been committed for years throughout China, on a significant scale, and Falun Gong practitioners have been one, and probably the main source of organ supply. The Chinese government has repeatedly denied the allegations, calling them politically motivated. In recent years, it has announced reforms, claiming that only voluntary donors are now used. But independent audits and undercover investigations continue to raise serious doubts. The ethical violation is staggering. Organ donation is supposed to be a sacred exchange, one life giving to save another. But in this system, human beings are reduced to spare parts, their bodies stripped for profit, their deaths timed for surgical convenience. It's not just unethical, it's industrialized murder. And yet the infrastructure remains. Hospitals equipped for high-speed transplants, databases matching blood types and tissue, military oversight, and an opaque legal system that shields everything behind state secrecy. The victims, if the allegations are true, leave no testimony, no trial, no grave. Their hearts beat in someone else's chest. Their kidneys filter blood in another country. Their names are erased. And what's left is a global silence. Some governments have passed resolutions condemning the practice. Others remain cautious, unwilling to challenge China directly. But the moral dilemma lingers. If even a portion of the claims are true, then the world's medical progress is hiding a shadow underneath it. One built not from research or consent, but from the disappearance of the voiceless and the terrifying efficiency of a system that learned how to turn life into inventory. Euthanasia device trials. It was small, white, almost elegant. To the untrained eye, it looked like a futuristic pod, something you might find in a minimalist living room or a sci-fi movie set. But this was no piece of furniture. This was Sarco, a 3D printed euthanasia device designed to offer what its creator called a peaceful, elegant death. But beneath the smooth surface, the concept was radical and deeply controversial. Because Sarco wasn't just a tool for assisted dying, it was designed to automate suicide. No doctors, no needles, no human approval, just you, a touchscreen, and a final yes. The story of Sarco begins with Dr. Philip Nitschke, a former Australian physician and founder of Exit International, a group that advocates for voluntary euthanasia and the right to die. Nitschke believed that end-of-life decisions should belong entirely to the individual, free from legal or medical gatekeeping. He envisioned a machine that could deliver a quick, painless death without requiring permission from doctors, governments, or institutions. And so Sarco was born. The machine works on a chillingly simple principle: oxygen deprivation. Once inside, the user answers a series of questions on a digital display, confirming they are choosing death of their own free will. After final confirmation, the machine floods the interior with nitrogen gas, quickly reducing oxygen levels to below 1%. The brain, deprived of oxygen, but not receiving a panic signal from carbon dioxide buildup, loses consciousness in seconds. Death follows within minutes. To its advocates, Sarco is the ultimate expression of bodily autonomy. To its critics, it's something else entirely: a suicide vending machine. Medical professionals raised concerns almost immediately. The process bypasses the psychological and medical evaluations traditionally required for assisted dying. It removes safeguards. It removes hesitation, and it opens the door to irreversible decisions made in moments of despair. Supporters countered that those safeguards are often barriers, tools of control, not compassion. They argued that terminally ill patients, or those suffering from unbearable psychological pain, should not have to beg for the right to die. They should have a dignified option on their terms. But the device's clinical neutrality was what made it so disturbing. Sarco isn't messy. It doesn't involve pills or blood or violence. It's quiet, clean, sterile. And that sterility raises ethical alarms because it sanitizes the act of death. It presents suicide not as a tragedy or last resort, but as a feature. In countries like the Netherlands and Switzerland, where euthanasia laws are more permissive, Sarco attracted real attention. Trials were proposed, prototypes were tested, exhibitions showcased the pod as a bold innovation. One version even included virtual reality previews, allowing users to experience the simulated moment of death, sinking into darkness, calmly and silently. But critics warned that designing death as an experience, like stepping into a spa capsule, blurred the line between agency and encouragement. And the bigger question remained: who decides when a life is no longer worth living? The patient? The machine? The culture surrounding it? The core ethical issue wasn't about ending pain. It was about removing friction from suicide. No second opinion, no human contact, just a yes and silence. Some psychiatric experts feared that the existence of such a device might influence vulnerable individuals, not those with terminal illness, but people battling temporary states of depression, hopelessness, or trauma. With Sarco, death could be made too easy, too accessible, too acceptable. The machine, by design, offers no resistance, and in that, it represents something chilling: a future where death is not an event, but an option, where suffering is met not with treatment or support, but with sleek technology and a final exit key. Dr. Nitschke defends Sarco by invoking dignity, choice, and control. But others ask, what happens when despair is given a touchscreen? And how long until society stops asking questions, because the answers have already been engineered? Death expression studies. In the final moments of life, the face speaks its own language. A twist of the mouth, a widening of the eyes, a tremor. For centuries, poets and philosophers wrote about the mystery of dying, the soul departing, the light fading, the expression changing in a way words couldn't capture. But in the mid-20th century, a group of researchers wanted more than metaphor. They wanted data. They asked, what does death look like, second by second? What expressions do people make in the instant before they die? Is there a universal face of fear, or peace, or something else? And so began a quiet, unnerving corner of science known as the death expression studies. These weren't fictions. They were real research efforts, carried out in hospitals, emergency rooms, prison execution chambers, and war zones. The goal to observe, document, and classify the human face at the threshold between life and death. In some cases, the studies were clinical. Patients in palliative care, often terminally ill, were filmed during their final hours. The cameras were small. The researchers stayed quiet. The subjects didn't always know they were being observed so closely. Dozens of faces, captured frame by frame. Tears, smiles, blank stares, sudden jolts. One researcher described it as watching the soul negotiate its departure. But not all the studies were gentle. In certain military and intelligence circles, there were unofficial records of interrogations and executions in which the victims' final expressions were photographed, sometimes under extreme conditions. The purpose wasn't compassion, it was control. Could the moment of death reveal something hidden, a secret, a pattern? One classified program reportedly analyzed the facial expressions of spies before execution, searching for signals of guilt or resistance. They wanted to know if the truth surfaced in the last second. But the most ethically disturbing variation came from a series of post-mortem facial coding trials conducted in the 1970s and 80s. These involved the facial action coding system, FACS, a method developed to quantify every micro-expression the human face can make, every muscle twitch, every brow movement, every twitch of the lip. Normally used in lie detection and emotion research, FACS was adapted to study death. Subjects, often terminal patients, or recently deceased individuals, were analyzed in high-resolution photography, sometimes video. Researchers broke down expressions into numerical patterns, trying to match certain emotions with precise facial movements. Some patterns emerged: a tightening of the orbital muscles around the eyes, downturned corners of the mouth, relaxation of the forehead. But what haunted many of the observers was not what they found, but what they didn't. Some faces showed no emotion at all, no peace, no fear, just blankness, as if something had been switched off, leaving behind an empty mask. And then there were the drowned subjects. In forensic studies, coroners and trauma researchers examined the faces of those who had died by drowning, not always to solve a crime, but to try to understand the psychophysiological process of death through suffocation. Some expected panic, eyes wide, mouth open, muscles clenched. Instead, they found something stranger: stillness. A look not of terror, but of surrender. Lips parted, eyes unfocused. A final moment, not of struggle, but of silence. As if the body, knowing it had lost, chose to retreat rather than resist. This phenomenon became known in some circles as the silent expression, a term used by pathologists to describe the paradoxical calm found in the moments just before or after asphyxiation. No scream, no flinch, just quiet. Some researchers believed this reflected a biological reflex, the body's systems shutting down. Others wondered if it was psychological, a last-second dissociation, the brain withdrawing from pain. But none of them could say for sure. What began as a scientific pursuit, measuring death, categorizing its signs, eventually circled back to philosophy. Because even with cameras and coding charts, the face of death refused to be fully understood. One subject smiled as he passed. Another cried. A third said nothing and simply faded. And every face was a final message no one could completely translate. The death expression studies were eventually criticized, not for the data, but for the distance they created. In trying to decode death, researchers had sometimes forgotten that these were people, not expressions, not variables, not patterns. They had lived, they were now gone, and what was left, it was a still frame, a flicker, a face that no longer looked back. The broken toy experiment. In the 1950s, psychologists at the University of Iowa wanted to study guilt, specifically how it developed in young children and how deeply it could be manipulated. The method was deceptively simple, but psychologically brutal. A child, usually between 3 and 6 years old, was brought into a room with a warm, friendly adult. The adult showed them a shiny, delicate toy and explained that it was very special and needed to be handled carefully. The adult then stepped out of the room, leaving the child alone. What the child didn't know was that the toy was rigged to break. The moment the child picked it up, a hidden mechanism caused it to fall apart in their hands. When the adult returned and saw the broken toy, they expressed shock, disappointment, and sadness, but not anger, just enough emotional withdrawal to trigger guilt. Some children burst into tears. Others tried to fix the toy or denied touching it at all. Many froze in shame. The researchers observed every reaction, noting how guilt emerged, how it changed behavior, and how long it lasted. The disturbing insight. Guilt could be deliberately installed, like a virus. The experiment was later used to study compliance, lying, and moral development. But what it revealed at its core was that even at a young age, a child could be emotionally broken by a single, scripted moment of betrayal. The toy wasn't the only thing that broke. Monkey drug trials. In the early 1960s, a series of drug self-administration experiments were conducted using monkeys and other primates. The goal was to test how addictive various substances were, not by observing withdrawal or overdose, but by seeing how far an animal would go to get the next hit. Monkeys were surgically implanted with intravenous lines and given levers they could press to inject themselves with drugs like morphine, cocaine, codeine, amphetamines, and even alcohol. There were no limits, no regulation of dose, no intervention, no protection. The monkeys quickly became addicted. Some pressed the levers hundreds of times per day. Others stopped eating or drinking. Some mutilated themselves or went into seizures. One monkey, hooked on cocaine, broke its own arm from convulsions but kept pressing the lever with the other. Others died within days of overdose, dehydration, or exhaustion. Researchers took notes. They wanted to know which drugs caused the fastest self-destruction, which patterns of use emerged, and whether any survival instincts remained. They didn't. The monkeys weren't being trained. They weren't rewarded. They were simply given access and allowed to spiral until they couldn't move. The studies were later used to demonstrate how powerful addiction could become without human morality or social context. But the images of trembling primates injecting themselves to death raise deep ethical questions about how far science will go to observe suffering without stepping in. They weren't looking for healing. They were waiting for collapse.